Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Nadje Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University. I'm also a professor of anthropology and Middle East studies. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all and welcome our guests today to an event entitled Islamo-leftism and Debates on Class, Gender and Religious Hierarchies in France. So some of you might wonder, why would we have a discussion on France at an American university at the Center for Middle East Studies? But as hopefully you'll be learning in our session, it's very relevant. I mean, for myself, when envisioning the program of the Center for Middle East Studies, I always wanted to link it to its diaspora as well, and wanted to link it to links bridging ideas around the Mashreq and the Maghreb, but also migrants, diasporic communities, and of course debates in different contexts such as the US, North America more broadly, but also Europe that are directly relevant to the Middle East. And clearly discussions around Islam, Islamophobia, which are quite prevalent in the US, but are also playing out differently in different contexts in Europe. I mean, I lived in the UK for 25 years, and there's a very different kind of dynamic, but there are parallels. At the same time, of course, having recently moved to the US, I'm very conscious of the debates here on critical race theory. And I was therefore very pleased when my colleague, Katharina Galor, Professor Katharina Galor, suggested to have this event. So this event is co-organized and co-hosted with Katharina Galor. She is the Hirschfeld Senior Lecturer in Judaic Studies at Brown University, where she's affiliated with the Center for Middle East Studies and the Center for Urban Studies. Professor Galor is an art historian and archaeologist specializing in the visual and material culture of Israel-Palestine. And I'm very happy that we are colleagues here at Brown. So Kati, would you please introduce the panel and kick us off? Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Nadje. Thank you, Éric, Nasira, Nona, and Éric for all being here. This is really a dream panel for us. We put you on the very top of our list when we started to approach colleagues in French academia. So we feel very blessed that you were all able to accept our invitation and to be here with us today. So French academia has gone through quite a bit of turmoil during the past year, and I'm not referring to the disruptions caused by COVID-19, which were of course no less significant than in the US. The academic and in fact political chaos we would like to place at the very center of our panel today is of a different nature and has stood in the media and political limelight, mostly in France, but to some extent also internationally. In October of 2020, Jean-Michel Blanquer, French Minister of National Education, cautioned that ce qu'on appelle l'islamo-gauchisme fait des ravages, in English what we refer to as Islamo-leftism, causes havoc. And he then publicly condemned what we described as intellectual complicity in terrorism. Now, the term Islamo-leftism was first introduced by French philosopher and historian Pierre-André Taguieff in 2002 in his book, La Nouvelle Judéophobie, the New Judeophobia, and was then also reintroduced under slightly different concept by Marine Le Pen, leader of the far-right National Rally, which was previously Le Front National, the National Front, when she was candidate for the presidency in 2012. And then last year it resurfaced in public discourses by President Emmanuel Macron and his colleagues, who basically started a public crusade against the so-called Islamo-leftist conspiracy in French society. And his efforts along those of the country's higher education ministry consist, I'm quoting Macron here, of strengthening the principles of the Republic. And he and his colleagues targeted specifically critical and progressive thinking in academia, including in the fields of post-colonial studies, imperial studies, race studies, gender studies, and intersectionality. And these debates, indeed attacks, have been compared by French political scientist Audrey Célestine to the McCarthyist era, when Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s tried to purge American institutions of suspected communist agents, militants, or sympathizers. Now, as Frederique Vidal, Minister of Higher Education, has stated herself, Islamo-leftism doesn't really have a scientific definition, but it corresponds sort of to a feeling. Those are her words. But rather than focusing on feelings here today, we will instead try to contextualize recent debates on this phantom phenomenon called Islamo-leftism. So with this in mind, we have gathered this group of 4 very distinguished French scholars, who are among those who have been either directly or indirectly targeted and attacked for promoting leftist discourses on gender, race, and also religious identities, or who have instead actively engaged in tackling these very issues in their research, but also on more public platforms nationally and internationally. So let me start with Professor Nona Meyer. Nona Meyer is a research director emerita of the CNRS, the French National Center for Scientific Research, which is attached to the Centre d'études européennes et de politique comparée in the Department of Sciences Po in Paris. And between 2005 and 2006, Professor Meyer chaired the French Political Science Association, and she also currently serves as co-principal investigator of the annual barometer on racism of the National Consultative Commission for Human Rights. And her main fields of expertise, and also her countless publications, are on electoral sociology, right-wing extremism, political participation, and racist and anti-Semitic prejudice, focusing on intercultural relations in France and in Europe, especially between Muslims and Jews. Now, Nona, given your research on prejudice against Muslim populations and also religion in France, you were publicly accused of being an infamous Islamo-leftism. And in March of this year, an anonymously written article published by a group that identifies itself as Observatory of Decolonialism accused you of giving scientific legitimacy to the term Islamophobia, of minimizing the importance of anti-Semitism, and also of importing dubious notions from the US, such as intersectionality, systemic racism, and whiteness from US academia, well, those US academics really. So this article, which was full of errors, approximations, and venom, was followed by several others, which then ultimately led to you being disqualified for the position you were previously announced for as a candidate, namely the presidency of the Fondation Nationale des Sciences Politiques. And I believe this really opened your eyes on the dangers and the scope of the attack on French academia, specifically the social sciences, but it has also strengthened in some ways, correct me if I'm wrong, your commitment to your research and also to your efforts to prove these allegations as wrong. And here my question to you, Nana. May I ask you to open this panel with a short explanation of the origin of the term Islamo-leftism and provide us also with a very brief historical overview, a chronology, if you will, of how Islamo-leftism has taken on center stage in French academia and media circles. And then could you perhaps summarize briefly the most recent events and debates on Islamo-leftism as you have observed them and also experienced them firsthand?
Thank you for inviting me and us on this very painful crusade against academics. I'll try to make it short. I have 5 minutes, more or less. Okay, so as you already said, a lot of things, but the origin of the word, it goes back to the writing of Pierre-André Taguieff, the philosopher Pierre-André Taguieff, in a book about the new Judeophobia that came out in 2002. And the idea was that there was a new anti-Semitism hidden behind the mask of anti-Zionism. And in that book, he targeted small groups that were committees in favor of the Palestinians. And he noted, and he wasn't wrong then, I mean, he noted the convergence between some radical Islamist activists and extreme left activists that were united against Israel in defense of the Palestinians, and the idea that they had a fight against imperialism. And that was that. I mean, at that moment, the term didn't develop. There was not much debate, and it was clearly defined. But then you have the French situation where at the heart of it, there's a Republican tradition, and the idea that secularization is essential, that we have a universal republic, and the fear of communitarism. And all that, all the debate that has come up now in the last 2 years starts in a way with what the so-called Islamic scarf affair, when young Muslim girls in the high schools were forbidden to wear their scarf in the classroom. So there you have something which is dividing the French society. And it's not only the extreme right, it's also the left. You have among the left some people who consider that they are true, genuine Republicans and that they must fight against Islamo-leftists. So what is the new definition of these Islamo-leftists? It's a real catch-all ideology. He has written a new book, Pierre-André Taguieff, and it's called Les Liaisons Dangereuses, dangerous liaisons or relationships. Islamo-nazism, Islamo-leftism. And there he says there's this temptation on the extreme left and on the extreme right. And there you have everything. It's the most fuzziest concept. It has absolutely no scientific coherence. It's over-victimization of Muslims, anti-racism, decolonialism, feminism, intersectionality, whiteness, all those who work on white prejudice. Why? It's the idea that this ideology is anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-West, anti-white, anti-old white men. And that's the confused package that the Frederique Vidal, the Minister of, and the Minister of Education, Blanquer, defend. So why? There is the fear of multiculturalism, the feeling that French society is threatened by communautarism. And it's been now, since the assassination of the Professor Samuel Paty last year, politically instrumentalized to delegitimize social sciences. We are considered as leftist, pro-Islam, pro-Islamist, and complacent towards terrorism. So that's the evolution of the term. And now it has nothing to do with the academic term. It's purely instrumentalized politically.
Okay, thank you so much, Nonna.
Mhm.
Very comprehensive.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some of those, of course, conflations I'm familiar with in different contexts. Before I'm going to introduce Nasira Gwenif Suleiman, I would like to just remind everyone that if you have a question or a comment, you can use the Q&A function in the webinar to do so. And we will hopefully have some time, and we will make some time for questions later on. So, well, thank you, Nonna, and welcome, Nasira. Nasira Gwenif is professor of sociology and anthropology at the University of Paris 8, Vincennes, Saint-Denis, and she is a senior member of the research center in CNRS. She holds a PhD in sociology from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and HDR from Sciences Po in Paris. In 2009, Nasira spent some time in the US as a Fulbright Fellow and was affiliated with Wellesley College, with Columbia University and NYU. Between 2011 and 2016, she was involved in 2 projects at Columbia University's Center for the Study of Social Difference, one on gender, religion, and law in Muslim societies, and the other on rethinking vulnerability and resistance, feminism and social change. In 2019, she was a visiting professor at the Institute for Research on Ethnicity, Migration and Society at Linköping University in Sweden. And between 2010 and 2019, she served as vice chair on the board of the ICI Islamic Cultures Institute of Paris. And so Nasira, you as well have been targeted and labeled Islamo-gauchist by various media networks and on a number of social media platforms, as well as by identitarian entrepreneurs. And it seemed that this was a campaign that seems to be supported, if not driven, actually by the government and politicians. Now, a situation that has affected you and the numerous junior researchers that you train and advise. You have been targeted, among others, because of your ethnicity, your background, your name, and you were accused, I think at some point, of being militant, of being alienated by your origins, of being disloyal to French values, and also of being anti-Semitic. So that's quite a bit. So my question to you, could you speak to us about the relationship between academia and politics in France? Now, especially, of course, with respect to the discussion on Islamo-leftism. And I guess, one main question that comes up is, how can politicians and legislation in France interfere so closely in academic life? Although, I mean, I shouldn't really be asking that question sitting here in the US, because we have seen, very similar interference. But, we're thinking of France as a nation that is considered to be democratic, in this standing, well, I don't know if it's standing for progressive values, but it's projecting progressive values. And lastly, how do these discourses actually impact the current election campaigns in France? And how do you think it will define, if at all, the outcome of next year's presidential elections in France that is, I think, supposed to take place in April of 2022? Sorry, it's a big chunk of questions, and I hope it's okay.
Thank you for inviting me and for offering me the opportunity to maybe make some space between what has been my own experience of being an Islamo-leftist in what I called Islamo-gauchist land, since it has become the place where this is coined and spread, and making space so that I can reflect on how all this happened. So maybe I want first to sketch the landscape and climate of what we are discussing, Islamo-leftists. And I think that there's 2 things that we should maybe have in mind, especially with regard to how the state has become the main promoter of Islamo-gauchism. So the backdrop first. So to my right-hand side, I would suggest that there is the state neoliberalization that started in 1983. It seems to be a long time, but it's quite the same time as when the National Front became center stage in France. So let's keep this in mind. And it's this neoliberalization is almost complete as we speak. In higher education, it has a corollary that wipes off equal treatment among civil servants, once the only status of all academics in the state-funded system, which makes a huge difference with the US one, for example. And instead, it instates a divided organization between prestigious international institutions, HESS, CNRS, Sciences Po, and so on and so forth, the ones that you find in the Shanghai ranking, for example, and partly funded by private donors and local regular institutions, universities geared towards supposedly less performing students, where non-elite scholars teach. I'm in one of them, but I'm perfectly fine with that. So ruled by competition and pitting colleagues against one another, such system is indeed divisive. No one could bear being labeled as less performing in such a competitive system. This rubs off on the climate among professionals and colleagues in universities and exacerbates resentment and a sense of loss of purpose and value. Once on its way, a demonetization of academics is now thriving. I insist on that because Islamo-leftism is also a way to demonetize certain academics, and this is how it plays out. So this is the perfect launch pad for attacks that is put in place. To my left-hand side, the French brand of identity politics, meant mainly to avoid naming French whiteness, is building up for almost 3 decades. So it's quite contemporary with the neoliberalization. It allows dismissing issues of race and racism, even of sexism, in the land of rights of man, as we all know it. Me Too was not enough up until recently, and it helped turning a blind eye on sexual harassment and abuse, including in universities. This is something we should keep in mind when we think of those old white men that want to save their power. And minimizing, if not ignoring, anything that has to do with not just the French colonial past, not even the recent army abandoned and encamped by the French state at the end of the Algerian independence war. This cannot make up for what still needs to be accomplished. But also its present coloniality, internal in the segregated suburbs that were once called, this Islamic, how do you say that? The place where Islam is flourishing, and external through proxy wars waged in Mali, in Afghanistan, as we all know, and the French colonial imprint still visible in distant islands and archipelagos scattered all across the globe. So I think we should keep that in mind also, because Islamo-leftism is also playing as a decoy about all this. All sorts of matters that, as we all know, are studied in academic institutions, France being no exception to this routine. It is its purpose and sometimes honor when and if it succeeds to do so, to pursue such research on all the topics that I just mentioned and those that you also mentioned before, to pursue such research and teach such knowledge when and if it is made available. These are 2 whens and ifs that may be addressed further in the conversation. Studying, making research, researching those issues that are also lumped under the term Islamo-leftism, and teach them. But we are facing a lot of issues in order to do this. So on this backdrop stands out what we are discussing as it pertains to both processes of neoliberalization and right racialization, and the foreclosure that they are together fueling. The landscape is more and more chaotic and the climate unbreathable, especially for those who fall under the category of Islamo-gauchiste. At any rate, the perfect targets of the attacks are identified. And so what used to be a sort of private joke among some fellow academics and civil society activists, namely being labeled as Islamo-gauchiste by media networks, social media, identitarian entrepreneurs, has become a state-driven campaign. Henceforth, it aims at expanding the usual suspects frame and lump together researchers focused on race, intersecting with gender, coloniality, class, religion, sexualization, nation, and more, some of whom assert their activism, and more recently, academics that so far didn't pay much attention to such label or thought they could turn a blind eye on it. So let us remind us that all that are listed Islamo-gauchists are not old Islamo-gauchists. You have the old ones, and the Nonamaya alluded to 2002. And back then, there were already people being labeled as Islamo-gauchists, especially because they fought against or they criticized the 2004 law against conspicuous religious signs. And some experienced this label for almost 2 decades, while some have just been upgraded to this distinctive mark, as I would put it. We are witnessing the expansion of the usual suspects, framing which includes people who often were not aware of or prefer not to remain ignorant of what Islamo-gauchism entails and the dangers it presents if it were to be trivialized, which is exactly what's happening. Professional disqualification, institutional pressure, cancellation of events, and we could go back to this, but since 2017, there have been many events, academic events, that have been canceled, and the pressure came from the central state. It came from the government. It did not come only from the institutions. Also cancellation of careers, people that cannot apply, that are labeled as Islamo-gauchiste and feel the consequences of such labeling. Or also, and this is not minor, silencing of voices inside the university. Far from the old ones were academics. Instead, they were first and foremost militants, activists, members of unions, and those who are among them were academics who were mainly viewed as falling into the trap of militantism, or again through a racialized lens, as under the influence of their origin, religion, gender, or any kind of mixing of a little bit of all of that. So it is in those circumstances that Islamo-gauchism has gained attention and has become a matter of political leverage in the perspective of the presidential elections. So it is not new that Islamo-leftism is a tool in order to control, in order to intimidate, in order to give also credit to some academics and deprive some of their credit. Mm-hmm. It is what is striking in what we are experiencing right now is the fact that the president didn't wait for the horrendous assassination of Samuel Paty in order to launch the campaign of Islamo-gauchism and the campaign against academics that are not responsible and that are not loyal to the state and to the nation. Right. He began this in February 2020, at the very time when the neoliberalization of the academia was completed. It was in the same month that the new law was announced, and that he decided to attack those academics that are supposed to be complacent with terrorism, and if not with those that literally engage with terrorism. So if I go back to your questions, and will not be able to answer them all because I think that my time is over.
Yes, your time is up. I was just going to say, sorry, Nasira.
Yeah, so I would just mention this. I think that Islamo-gauchisme acts as a decoy, but also as a political campaign in order to avoid speaking of the French whiteness and of the way race is central to the organization of the French society. This should not be mentioned, and so Islam is the perfect decoy in order to disempower academics that research and teach that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nasira. I mean, there's a lot here now on the table between what Nonna already taught us and you. And actually, I'm eager to hear also from Eléonore and Éric, and I know Kati will take over in a moment. But I guess I was reminded when you were speaking this morning in The Guardian, I was actually reading an article which was describing Sandrine Rousseau as an eco-feminist. And I'm, actually maybe later on in the discussion, I'm curious to know what you think of her, because I know from the German context that you have, of course, these feminists who are kind of right-wing feminists who are racist as well, but she's described as the eco-feminist who's anti-racist. So I was wondering what your position is on that. But let me ask Kati to continue now. Thanks.
Yeah, so it's a pleasure to introduce Eléonore Lépinard. Eléonore is Associate Professor in Gender Studies at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And her main areas of research are in the fields of feminist movements and theory and law, intersectionality, and gender and political representation. She has published widely on feminist and intersectional politics, on Islamophobia, and on femo-nationalism with a geographical focus on France, Europe, and Quebec. Now, Eléonore, you have not been a direct target of the attacks against Islamo-gauchistes, though as a gender studies scholar with a focus on intersectionality, gender, and Islamophobia, you really would have been the perfect victim. Now, your relationship to the topics surrounding these debates on Islamo-leftism is thus much more strongly defined by your advocacy and scholarship, I would say. In fact, in your co-authored article with Sarah Mazou's Cartographie du Surplan, which you were, if I'm not mistaken, invited to also publish as a more popular book meant to reach a wider readership beyond academic circles. This article addresses these very issues we're discussing here. And it will be interesting to see if you and Sarah Mazou's will turn into a target over these next few months. France has really turned into sort of battlefield of ideology as it prepares for the upcoming elections in 2020. And so, here my question to you. As you may have noticed in regard to the general program of Brown University's Center for Middle East Studies, specifically since Nadje Al-Ali has taken on the directorship, there is a very strong interest in and commitment to gender studies, in feminist activism and scholarship. And so we would love to hear from a scholar who's deeply anchored in these fields of research, how you see and how you explain the relationship between anti-gender discourses, the attacks on feminism, and also the recent debates on Islamo-leftism.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you also, Nadje, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Nasira also mentioned, to actually have the opportunity to exchange with colleagues about what's happening, because although some of us, and especially Nasira, have been like targeted and embedded in these problems for a very long time, it's still difficult to wrap your mind around what's actually going on and how it's going to unfold in the future. We don't have a crystal ball, but it's not looking super good, let's say. And so it's very nice to be able to exchange on this and on the kind of trying to make sense of the dynamics that are going on there. And so I was reflecting on your question about what's the potential link, because before attacks on intersectionality by the Minister of Education, Minister for Research, there's been a kind of decade almost of attacks against gender studies, which are not particular to France, which are, spread across Europe in many countries by the more traditional Catholic right-wing parties or coalitions, and there's been defunding of some programs across Europe. There's been also defunding in the Parisian region of funding programs in gender studies, etc. So there's been this going on, right? But Macron and his government, which, in what really looked like a kind of war machine, right? It's really programmed. And as Nasira said, it started before, and it's been like in several steps, targeting academia in like several Macron and then Blanquer and then Vidal. So it really looked organized in this kind of progression. So the attack on gender studies is kind of indirect, right? It goes through intersectionality, which of course they don't know what they're talking about. So it's not clear if they know they are attacking gender studies, especially from Vidal or Macron. Macron declared himself recently in a popular magazine, women's magazine, a feminist, with a particular brand of feminism, because he decided that, feminism, being a feminist is being against a crop top at schools, or, like he had a very precise definition of what's a good feminist. And so I'm not sure there is a total convergence between the traditional attacks from the Catholic right against what has been labeled as gender ideology and gender theory, whatever, which has been going on for quite a long time, and the recent attacks. So, it might well happen, but it's coming from kind of different corners and different types of discourses. And to some extent, Macron's government has been more femo-nationalist than anti-gender studies. So there's been like this really use of feminist discourse to stigmatize Islam, Muslims, migrants, etc., etc. And this has been very obvious from the current former minister or state secretary for women's rights. And it's not new, because like the former one under Hollande already had that kind of discourse. So it's not sure how those types of dynamics are going to merge or not, since Macron has presented himself as a modernist in terms of gender relations. In many ways, he put he had a parity of female candidates on his candidate lists for the parliamentary election. So he had this kind of very modern discourse to distantiate himself from the more traditional right-wing parties. So he's been using really feminism in this very femo-nationalist type of vein to, as I said, like stigmatized Islam and Muslims. So I'm not sure how this is going to overlap and to consolidate together. But they're very creative, so I'm sure they can find a way to reconcile this type of dynamics. Then I think where you see that convergence is more actually inside academia. So I think like the government has been kind of avoiding to blame the feminists, because we are at the kind of high point of a kind of wave right now. And so I think it's bad publicity right now to blame the feminists. And Macron says he's a feminist, but inside academia, you really see that convergence against gender studies, every kind of studies, but especially, of course, everything that has to do with some kind of critical race theory or talking about race in any kind of way. So I think that's what's concerning, and also should make us reflect. Like you mentioned, Nadje, that there's this kind of propensity from political authorities to intrude into French academia. But I'd say that what's also concerning is the inability or unwillingness of French academic institutions to resist that intrusion. And so we have to think about, you know, like Nassira mentioned, the neoliberalization of academia. But there's also the fact that we are still talking about public university, public servants. We're talking about institutions who don't seem to care about what students want to study. Like they are really turning a deaf ear to, like, you know, I'm sure Nassira has packed class, and Éric as well. And, you know, everybody working on this topic has a lot of students coming in the classroom to learn this knowledge. And the university don't care about that, right? So there's been no institutionalization of those fields of study. The institutionalization of gender studies has been, you know, mild or like halfway through. But so there's no place of institutional resistance to those critiques. And I think that's what's really concerning for the future, that at the very time, because Nassira said that it's the time of like the achievement or the completion of the neoliberalization of academia, but it's also the time where a generation of people who have been trained by people like Nassira are more numerous, have gained position into academia, working on race, working on Islamophobia, working on those issues. So have finally a place in academia, and they're, of course, a very tiny minority, but more people than 15 or 20 or 25 years ago. And at that very time, there is this kind of preventive attack to prevent the institutionalization of that field of study. So I think that dynamic is very concerning, that from within academia, within even social science, there is this convergence with public discourse from right-wing, from the government against specific type of minoritized knowledge. So the little book that we wrote with Sarah Mazouz was also an attempt at not addressing, but at least pointing the problem of this convergence between a sector of French social science and French academia and these conservative discourses. I don't like to talk about French exceptionalism because like conservatism is everywhere and populism is everywhere, and anti-gender discourse, and, you know, France is not the only European country which does not want to talk about race. But the fact that from within academia, there's such a strong resistance to the emergence of this topic makes it really difficult to, resist political pressure.
Yes.
Eléonore, may I ask, when you talk about the convergence of French academia with politicians or policies, would you make a difference? Would you distinguish between the administration and professors? Is it mostly...
My colleagues working in France, I'm sure, have lots of answer for that. I think there's a tradition of political intrusion at the administrative level, for nomination or election of university rectors and presidents and stuff, and that's one thing. But I'm also talking about academics, like about scholars who find probably an opportunity for broader mediatic exposure or I don't know, a sense to their ending and academic career, or, to revamp themselves with a cause, or I have really no clue about what's their motivation, except like defending whiteness, obviously. Mm-hmm. But there's really from within academia, even from within social sciences. So, and what's kind of really concerning, but I'm sure Nassira and Éric can also talk about this, is that to a certain extent, people who have attacked, for example, Nona, the Observatoire du décolonialisme, are, a lot of people are not really in social science, or they're doing medieval history, or like physics or whatever. But so, yeah, so what's concerning, and I'm sure the other panelists share this, is that when doctoral students or postdocs submit paper on racial issues in France or in other countries, but especially in France, to French journals in social science, and like they get, answer like, your paper really raised a lot of debates inside the editorial committee. And these are committees where, it's also young academics, young colleagues. And so it seems like it's not only about a generation that has been refusing to take on those topics. It is really something which is more structural and transversal to academia. The refusal to talk about race as a topic for social science and for inquiry and for producing knowledge. So I think that's really concerning, that you see that within, social science journal, people would say, we're uncomfortable, we're not sure. As if, you can never reach a scientific consensus. You can about the quality of a work when it's.
I wonder if governmental funding of universities, of higher education, has something to do with it. But maybe we'll leave that to the discussion and move on to Éric.
Yes. Also, I'm conscious we actually have already 2 questions from the audience, and I really would like us to make some time. But Éric, welcome as well. So Éric Fassin, since 2012, Professor Éric Fassin has been a professor of sociology, also at Paris 8 University in the Department of Political Science and the Department of Gender Studies. Previously, he had spent 5 years at New York University and 18 years at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He is affiliated with the first research center in gender studies in France, which was created in 2015, Laboratoire d'études de genre et de sexualité. His research focuses on contemporary sexual and racial politics with a comparative transnational perspective. He has co-founded a network in defense of gender studies called the Gender International. And can I just make a very quick plug here, because Kati and I are also co-organizing jointly with Humboldt University a conference that's actually very, very relevant to this discussion, which is a conference that looks at Europe and the Middle East and anti-gender discourses and homophobic discourses, the political right, and sort of really trying to de-exceptionalize either specific European countries or the Middle East. So that's happening tomorrow and also Saturday. You can find more information on our website. But Éric, your scholarly work has been part of your political commitment as a sociologue engagé. In June of last year, you were co-organizer of an international conference on current attacks on academia in France and beyond. And I believe the papers will be published as an ebook on Mediapart in the coming days. You were invited by Medinal, Regard France, France TV Info, France Culture to present your views on the discourse on Islamo-leftism to the public. And the leading French papers, including Le Monde, Le Figaro, and also some international outlets such as NPR, The Washington Post, and The New York Times, have highlighted your efforts both nationally and internationally. So I would actually like to repeat the question that Kati just asked Eléonore, and ask you, if you can share with us how you see the relationship between anti-gender discourse, attacks on feminism, and the recent debates on Islamo-leftism. Thank you, Éric.
Thank you, Nadje, and thank you, Katharina, and thank you for the center organizing an event like this. I think it's useful. And it's a pleasure to be with the other panelists, but maybe I could start with the fact that 2 of us are from Paris 8 University. I think it's significant. This is a university that has been presented as the embodiment of Islamo-leftism. Now, it's not very surprising. It's a left-wing university, and it's a university with a working class, partly or largely non-white population of students, not so much of faculty. So it's not surprising, but at the same time, both Nassira and I are in a gender studies research center. That's a bit more surprising because how do the two work together? It used to be not so long ago that basically it was claimed that the problem was that others, racialized others, were against equality between the sexes, equality between sexualities, etc. That is against what I tend to call sexual democracy. So basically, you had to choose. Either you were on the side of gender studies and sexual democracy, or you were defending racial minorities and therefore siding with Muslims. That was the idea. So how come the two are working together today? That is basically, how come they like neither Nassira nor me? That's my personal question. Now, if we think in these terms, because I think we're both very likable, so how come? I think one way to look at it, and I would like to use a concept that I tried to develop in reference to Claude Lévi-Strauss. You know, Claude Lévi-Strauss talked about a floating signifier. That is, a word like thing or stuff can refer to all kinds of different signifiers. Now, there's a term that functions like this in French debates, but also in American debates. It's the term political correctness. Political correctness is a floating signifier. That is, it can refer to all kinds of things we don't like. Whatever you don't like is politically correct. Now, I suggest talking not about a floating signifier in this case, but floating signified. That in fact, if you look at the current debates, sometimes it's about gender, sometimes about intersectionality, sometimes about cancel culture, sometimes woke culture or wokeism, etc. Or of course, Islamo-leftism. So you have all kinds of words, but it's only one meaning. It's basically critical thought. So critical thought is the floating signified as opposed to the floating signifier. It's floating, it's very vague, but it lumps everything together. Now, I think that's an issue for those of us who've been involved in gender studies for a long time, because basically the traditional problem we, and especially women who've been working this field for a long time, were faced with was the fact that people didn't care. They were condescending. They thought gender studies, that's in France, is not a French thing. We don't care, it's not interesting. Then we had a second problem, which was instrumentalization. Basically, what I said before, instrumentalizing sexual democracy against racial minorities. Basically, we're good to women, we're good to gays. Unfortunately, Arabs, Muslims, Blacks, they're not. That was the dominant theme in the years 2000. Today, we're confronted with a third option, not indifference and condescension, not instrumentalization and co-optation, but in fact, sheer hostility. At the same time, and this I think is present even in the government, after all, and the minister, Jean-Michel Blanquer, the Minister of Education, is also targeting so-called inclusive writing, l'écriture inclusive. That's one of their targets. And why are they targeting intersectionality and not just race? Because it's a way of saying, don't forget, it's also about gender. So I think we should not minimize how they're lumping things together, even at the level of the government. So I think we should really pay attention to the fact that a few years ago, when you had the mobilizations against gay marriage in France, you could feel that it was a difficult choice. are we, for people on the far right, are we to decide that the main issue is gender? And in that case, why not make alliances with Muslims and with Arabs and with everyone who's a conservative sexually? That was the far right idea for someone like Brigitte Bardot. The other option was, no, we can't do that. We can't do that because in fact, the real primary issue is race. So I think the question of whether race is the primary issue or gender has been around for a while. And basically, I think the US president, the former president, Donald Trump, found a solution. You can play both cards at the same time. You can be both racist and a sexist person. So I think this form of neo-fascism, which has evolved not just in the US, but also in Brazil and in many other countries, is something that is currently exploding in France. So it's not just about France.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I think that's something that we, in preparation of this, conference we're organizing, we're seeing this. I mean, I've been very much focusing on the Middle East, and of course, there is definitely an exceptionalizing of the Middle East going on. But I think, as you rightly point out, this form of right-wing populism that no matter whether in which actually religious context or whether it's religious or secular, centers gender and sexuality and racism as well. Yeah, thank you very much, Éric. Kati, would you like to continue?
Yeah, perhaps the last question. Having worked and published myself on the relationship between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in Germany, I would be interested in getting a better sense about the connection between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in France, or perhaps the lack thereof. This is an important issue that has only been, I would say, marginally addressed in the context of the most recent discussions on Islamo-leftism, unless I missed it. And I understand that the sensitivities in France are different from those we have in Germany. But it is a complex issue, and I would be very interested in hearing your views on it. I don't know if perhaps Nonna or Nasira could
both. I think both
answer this question.
Yeah. Well, it's one of my field of expertise, anti-Semitism. So I'm glad to tackle that question. But first, maybe, what do we mean by Islamophobia? Because it is at the heart of the crusade against Islamo-leftists. We are accused of using that word, Islamophobia, and that's a bad word. It's supposed to prohibit any criticism of Islam, which is a strange conception of the word. I assume using the word Islamophobia, it's not the best word, negrophobia, homophobia, anti-Semitism, none of these words are very good words to describe a prejudice, but I use Islamophobia, like most social sciences in France and abroad, to define prejudice against Muslim and or Islam. That's it, and that's all. There's all the pathos around it is ridiculous. So once you have defined Islamophobia as aversion to Islam, well, on the side of those who accuse us to be Islamo-leftist, any person using the very word of Islamophobia is somebody who is a potential anti-Semite, because they accuse us the moment we work on prejudice against Muslims, prejudice against Islam, to minimize the importance of anti-Semitism, as if you describe the prejudice that Muslim suffers, you are insensitive to the problem Jews can suffer when there's prejudice against them. But there's that theory of substitution. We, using that word of Islamophobia, we Islamo-leftists are supposed to substitute Islamophobia as a problem today to anti-Semitism, minimize, if not deny, the very existence of anti-Semitism. That has been reproached to me, clearly, that I am denying or leaving aside the importance of it, which is ridiculous. Now, I work for the annual survey of the National Commission for Human Rights with a whole team of researchers. So it's one small part of racism, prejudice. Racism is far more than prejudice. It's actions, violences, discriminations. I'm working on prejudice. Prejudice is important because in a society, prejudice tells you what is the norm, what is accepted, what is rejected. So it's important to work on prejudice as to work on everything else. And we have a survey every year asking on all forms of prejudice against all minorities. And what we show with that data, it's that it's the exact opposite. It's the people who have the highest aversion to Islam, who in the majority population are by far the most anti-Semitic. So that's very important, but it's the reverse than what the people who accuse us, the reality is the reverse. Every racism has a specific history. Anti-Semitism has probably the longest history of all. There have been waves after waves of anti-Semitism on different arguments. Every racism is different, and yet they all have something in common. We can make attitudinal scales. Those who don't like Arabs, don't like Jews, don't like Muslims, don't like foreigners. And if you add on a list an imaginary country, they will reject it because they don't know it. That's attitudes, prejudice. Well, in that sense, there's a clear connection in the majoritarian population between holding aversion against Muslims and putting Jews away. Now, of course, you can say, but what about minorities? There is prejudice. Everybody can have prejudice, even if you're a racialized minority. There is prejudice between Jews and Muslims. There are neighborhoods where there are violences, but these are very small compared to the mass of anti-Semitic prejudice in France today. They are in the majority population. And it's the old prejudice, the old anti-Semitic prejudice, associating Jews with money and power, and not the new anti-Semitism, which is linked to severe criticisms of the state of Israel. So let's put things as they are and leave aside all these stupid debates about Islamophobia being a way to forbid any criticism of the religious, of Muslim religions.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you so much, Nona. There are actually more parallels than I realized. Perhaps one of the differences is that there is a lot of attention to anti-Semitism in the German public, and even though the numbers are significantly lower than incidents of Islamophobia, so there's sort of a hierarchy, but there's also a lot of anxiety, even among scholars, to bring these two phenomenon into dialogue. But what is very similar to France is, I think, that there is this public attack on minorities, Muslims, for reintroducing anti-Semitism into the country. And when you look at statistics, police statistics, I mean, it is usually the ultra right-wing white populations of Germany who are both anti-Semitic and Islamophobes.
Yes, but I was just talking of opinions, and it's not the same logic at all of opinions.
Yeah.
Can I just interject here before asking Nasira, and maybe Nasira has a view on that as well. I mean, I guess, thank you very much, Nona. I mean, I really appreciate it. I guess I would push back in your sort of distinction between the old and new anti-Semitism, because you seem to quite unproblematically equate critique of Israel with anti-Semitism. And I think many of us feel quite uncomfortable. No, okay, I just—
Of course not. I mean,
okay.
It's the opposite.
Right.
I mean,
okay.
Any criticism of Israel, I mean, go to Israel. The people who are the most critical of Israel is the Israeli left. And I read Haaretz and you'll see criticism of Israel. That's very stupid. I mean, it's not criticism of Israel. The Pierre-André Taguieff is the one who theorized the new Judeophobia with the idea that it's replacing the old anti-Semitism. What I is that it's not. It's the
Right.
old anti-Semitism, which
I
is
see.
far more predominant in the public opinion. And what do you call anti-Zionism? Criticism of the policy of Israel is not anti-Zionism. The only thing that you could label as a form of anti-Semitism would be if you want to wipe out completely the population of Israel from the surface of the world. There you may see it as anti-Semitism, but mere criticism, of course not. And that's why we would also enter a debate about the new definition of IRA of anti-Semitism. Right? So that's not at all my position.
Okay, no, thanks for
In our
clarifying. I'm
report,
glad
we
I
show
asked that.
that.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Sorry, Nasira, you were just about to also respond.
Yes, just maybe to emphasize the fact that what we are experiencing in France in terms of lumping together anything that has to do with Islamophobia with a sort of anti-Semitism is the way this all rings a bell in the French spirit and in the French imaginary. And I think it's important to stress the fact that it's very useful today to keep on saying something that Nona just mentioned is not true and cannot be defined properly. The fact that using anything that has to do with Islamism and the presence of Muslims in France in terms of denying what has been in the history of France regarding the Jews and anti-Semitism is something that brings a lot of benefit towards the French government and to the French population. It has to do with the foreclosure that I was mentioning before. It's a way to never address the reality and to always put the blame on those that are supposed to be disloyal to France, and never defined as minorities, basically being viewed as disloyal. So a way to be loyal is to accept what is also gaining momentum in France, which is the IRAH definition of anti-Semitism. It is gaining a lot of attention in France, and it might end up to be the same as in Germany. And I was disinvited from a conference organized by sociologists in Germany on the grounds that since I support BDS, the academic BDS, I was anti-Semite and anti-Semitic. So that's really interesting to see that it functions quite and that nobody ever questions the fact that you can be viewed as such. And of course, it plays out in the wider society very strongly.
Yeah, thank you, Nasira. Éric, you just wanted to quickly come in with a comment?
Just a quick comment. Yes, thank you. The attacks against what I would call critical thought are very often attacks on the social sciences in particular. And what is interesting is that there's a link between the issue of anti-Semitism as it is framed in the public debate and those attacks. Because in fact, we are told that explaining is justifying. This phrase has been used to talk about everything, in particular, explaining terrorism is justifying terrorism, explaining urban violence is justifying urban violence, etc. But the first time this was used by Nicolas Sarkozy was about anti-Semitism. That is, the idea that explaining anti-Semitism is a justification of anti-Semitism is the starting point of all this rhetoric that is anti-critical thought, anti-social sciences, which is a way, of course, not of saying we shouldn't explain, but let's explain in our own way. For example, it's all the fault of Arabs and Muslims and Blacks and migrants, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Éric. Okay, so I'm going now to the audience questions. Actually, the first one sort of very much links to a question I was also going to ask to particularly Eléonore and Éric, and this is Anushka Srivastava, who is asking, do you think the identity politics framework was imported by American academics and activists? Would it have been endogenously created without outside influence within the context of France's culture? And so that question actually links to a question had a kind of, I guess, slightly wider question about the impact and the relationship between US academia, especially in terms of debates on ethnicity, race, gender, critical race theory. I mean, we know that, of course, we know that US academia has been, or US academics have been blamed for their negative influence on French scholarship, and it's kind of ironic because, of course, American, whether it's critical race theory or gender studies, I mean, is of course also very much influenced by French philosophy. But so I guess maybe particularly Éric and Eléonore, if you could answer the more specific question around identity politics that Anushka is asking, and the broader question about the impact of US academic thought on France's scholarship.
Who starts?
Eléonore, would you like to start as well?
Yeah, I'm sure Éric has a book on the topic. So I'll speak first before he says everything. No, so of course, I mean the accusation of importing as a way of saying it's not French, it's un-French, it's not Republican, it has a long history, and intersectionality is like the latest kind of supposedly importation from the US. So it works as a way to delegitimize every discussion on the French context. As Nassira said, it's another decoy, right? And of course, but on the other hand, of course, I mean, there's a lot of transnational discussion in academia, but also among activists, especially now with the social networks. So of course, now you have practices that are, that are branded in English, like check your privilege, that you will find in activist circle, of course, in France and in Europe, in English, like check tes privilèges. So you can't deny that there's a lot of discussion that Black Lives Matter has had a tremendous influence in many countries in Europe for the better. And so it would be kind of hypocritical, right, to say that there's no influence of the US debates on the discussion in France. Thank God for the US sometime, right? So we can ask some questions. But of course, it erases the work of scholars in France, in other European countries where you find this kind of discussion that have been working on these topics for a very long time. And so it also prevents analyzing, especially among French academics who tend to relay this kind of discourse about importation. It really erases the work of French scholars who have been working on this topic for a very long time. It also has this kind of invisibilization effect of the genealogies in France, in Europe, on this topic that have been, and all the work of erasure that has been done, so that those critical work didn't have the exposure in academia and in the public space that they should have. So I think it works in multiple ways, this accusation of importation. But I'm sure Éric has a very eloquent answer about this.
Yeah, thanks, Eléonore. And I guess, while, there might be that sort of tension between sort of French academics and US academics, and I think both are probably complicit in making invisible and erasing, of course, the knowledge production of scholars and activists elsewhere. I mean, I'm thinking the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, Asia. I mean, that's, of course, another dimension. And then, of course, people in diasporic context. But Éric, what is your take on this question?
Well, indeed, as Eléonore kindly pointed out, I've been involved in this for 30 years, and the accusation of Americanization is part of the debate every time you talk about minority issues. So I've talked about what I call the American scarecrow for 30 years. But of course, what this means is not just anti-Americanism, it's a nationalization of debates, as if this were uniquely about French culture. What is interesting is that reviving this rhetoric at a moment when you have an internationalization of these issues, which is not just exported from the US, but in fact, which is happening in all kinds of places for similar reasons, I think that's the striking phenomenon. The attempt at maintaining a framework of interpretation that is based on the nation. It's not just about the nation. It's a back and forth between nation and internationalization. That's the first point. The second thing that I would like to respond is that personally, I don't feel that any of my work, and I don't think that most of the people I know's work is about identity politics. I personally systematically reject that term, starting with the fact I've been accused in France repeatedly of embodying gauche identitaire. And I always have a problem with that. Which identity? After all, I'm an aging white male. That's not the best profile to embody minority issues. I don't look the part. So in fact, what this means is that it's not about identity, because otherwise I would just have to remain silent. It's about minority issues, which is quite different, because in fact, minority issues are a concern to anyone, regardless of whether you belong to a minority or not, because it has to do with democratic principles such as freedom and equality. So in fact, if you look at the moment when Macron attacked in Le Monde in June 2020, intersectionality, it coincided exactly with the mobilization of the committee Adama Traoré. What was interesting is that the committee Adama Traoré is not talking about identity politics. They're talking about justice. They're talking about equality. So in fact, the whole rhetoric of identity politics is a way of denying what people are saying. People talk about equality and they're accused of engaging in identity politics. The demonstration by Comité Adama Traoré took place Place de la République. How more symbolic can you get? And in fact, they made people sing La Marseillaise. How more Republican can you be? So it's interesting that in fact, the people who claim the term Republican have become so anti-Republican, or rather they've become Republicans in the way that the Republican Party in the US is Republican.
Thank you, Éric. Kati, I suggest maybe if you can read out the remaining questions, and we only have 10 minutes left, so then I will invite all of you to reply to one of the questions briefly, just a couple of minutes. Kati, you want to go ahead and read them?
Yeah, I will start with the very short ones in case we can't get to the longer one. So, so the question is as follows: within French academia, is critical thought mainly practiced by social scientists, or does it also influence the humanities? Is it, can anybody answer to this?
Nasira wants to answer, no?
Yes, I saw the question. Actually, I think that critical thought is much more accepted and welcome in the humanities than it is by social scientists or by social sciences. For example, when you think in terms of, let's take an example, post-colonial studies, it's obviously something that you will find in comparative literature a lot, in all fields, even in philosophy sometimes. But when it comes to social sciences, there is this resistance to to engage with the notion of what it means to think in terms of colonial, decolonial thought. And so, yes, it has an influence. Actually, it's well and quite peacefully embedded in the French humanities, and it's not at all in social sciences. And this is part of the problem. This is why Islamo-leftism can be used against people who are supposed to use those theories in ways to be divisive and to hit or to hurt the French cohesion.
Okay, thank you, Nasira. Another quick question, short question. Are there any other spaces in France besides the universities where the state media think Islamo-leftists exist? I mean, are there journalists or intellectuals who are not academics who are also targeted? Éric.
I think one obvious place to look is the social networks. Basically, there's been a circulation between first the social media, second the media, magazines like Marianne, like Le Point, like Valeurs Actuelles, Causeur, etc. Third, government members and politicians in the National Assembly in particular. So in fact, I think the missing piece in some of our discussions is social networks, because of course that amplifies everything. But the traditional media, of course, have been very important. After all, we've seen the development of the equivalent of Fox News in France in the last few years.
May I suggest that, for example, you could think, I think that Nadje, you mentioned Sandrine Rousseau earlier in the conversation.
Yes.
She might end up being smeared as Islamo-gauchiste.
All right. Yeah, I was
Very
wondering
likely
about that. Yes.
That she will be dismissed, you know, as a candidate for the presidency, because there are only two Green Party contestants remaining, and she's one of them. And a very, you know, comfortable and effective way of dismissing her would be to define her as an Islamo-leftist.
Yeah, I was wondering. Yes, thanks, Nasira.
Do we have time?
Well, we have maybe for one more question.
Short answer to the point. Aristide Briand and Jean Jaurès, the founders of the French law on the separation of church and state of 1905, were defamed as socialo-papalins in their time as socialists that presumably operate in the service of the Pope. Are there any structural similarities or historical continuities to today's discourse on Islamo-gauchism, or is a comparison too much of a stretch?
Just a word. I mean, I don't have that good of a memory of my history classes on the Third Republic, right? But I think one of the problems we have right now is that the accusation of Islamo-leftist is also present in the left. So, and I think Jaurès didn't have to deal with that. You know, he had to deal with the right. He didn't have to deal with the attacks from within his own camp. So I think that makes it a bit trickier today.
Okay.
So maybe we can read out the final question as well. Should I go ahead and do that?
Please do so, yeah.
So I've been surprised by the debates between the Macron government, Le Pen, and Zemmour in preparation for the election, where all parties seem to be in total agreement on the specter of Islamo-leftism. In the public sphere and media, has the right obtained a monopoly over discussions of race and French identity? Where can we hear the dissenting voices in these debates?
May I, maybe just to follow up on what Eléonore just mentioned, in my preparing my own contribution to the conversation, I was pointing to the fact that sometimes the left doesn't need the right in order to be racist in France. And this has to do with this old colonial rule, I mean, that still kind of lives on in French society. So what is very concerning is the fact that, of course, the right has gained momentum and the far right has gained momentum, or maybe what is now called in France, la droite extrême. So the right extreme, which is not exactly the same thing as the far right or the extreme right. And the thing is that sometimes you have la droite extrême at the left. And so among leftists, so it's more and more difficult to disentangle all these tendencies and to understand exactly. So this is why Islamo-leftism is kind of consensual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Éric?
I would say that what's happened in France, but not just in France, is the ideological collapse of the left in the last 40 years, progressively and more rapidly. For example, the Socialist Party, which was a dominant party, is today pretty much dead. So I think it's a problem, of course, that has to do with the ideological battle. The one name that everyone invokes, especially on the right, is Gramsci. That is the idea of hegemony, of cultural ideological hegemony. And indeed, we can see that the right has prevailed. There are many reasons, including the fact that the media are controlled by wealthy businessmen, for example, all kinds of reasons. But the result is the ideological collapse of the left. So where can we find alternative discourses, not in the public sphere, but among counter publics? And I think counter publics are people who may not have access to the dominant public sphere, but who are still thinking and who are still creative. And in particular, we've seen that in racial terms. That is basically those who don't have access to the dominant public sphere, they're doing their work, they're talking to a different audience. And in that sense, they're creating a counter public that I think may not be as visible from the outside, but is equally important.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, good point. I really appreciate that and actually very much agree. I mean, this conversation is, really, I mean, although it is depressing and sad, but it's also really interesting. And I feel very humbled and inspired listening to you. And I wish we could go on, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So before handing it over to Katja to say a few final words, I just want to thank all of you. I really appreciate it. I hope that we will continue this conversation, maybe at some point in person. Yes, many thanks. Also, many thanks to those of you who watched live or will watch the recording later on. Katja, also many thanks for inspiring me to do this event jointly with you. Would you like to say a few words?
Just that I'm really delighted. I think, this really stimulated many thoughts and opened really the ground for continued conversation.
Yes.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Yeah. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for inviting us.